need a plan B. In order to win or get what you want, you have to be willing to walk away.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Entrepreneurship 101. And hello to those that are watching online at the satellite centers and on the webcast. Tonight's lecture on negotiations is going to cover the strategy and tactics associated with effective negotiation and includes tips and practical examples for entrepreneurs to be more effective negotiators. Our speakers tonight are joining us from Davis LLP. Ted Maduri is a partner in the corporate, commercial, and corporate finance groups. He advises clients on a range of corporate matters with a specific focus on IT and IP-based companies. And Andrew Lord is a corporate commercial partner with a background in engineering and business consulting. He works with clients in a broad range of industries and has particular experience in the power generation and IT sectors. Please welcome our speakers tonight.
Thank you very much. We're very excited to be here tonight. I'm personally very excited to be here because I think negotiations are sort of every stage of my life is a negotiation, and I treat it as such. It must be fun to be my wife, but I actually think this is going to be a fun conversation. We took off our ties because we want to keep it very casual. We also, sometimes these sessions have questions at the end, but we want to keep it lively, so to the extent you have questions, please interrupt us, and we'll address the question then. Unless you're trying to get free legal advice and it's very much about your situation, in which case we'll ask you to talk to us at the end. So we're going to try to keep this very practical. There's not going to be a lot of theory. There's, I think, just one slide on negotiation theory. I'm going to talk about negotiation strategy, and that's really just taking a step back and before you jump into the negotiation, really figure out what your goals are and do your homework and things of the strategic nature. Andrew's going to talk about tactics. You're into the negotiation, and what does it look like? When can you use different tactics to get what you're after? We're doing a bullet. We're trying to keep this really high level, so there's not a lot of detail to our slides. We're going to do a bulletin where a lot of these points will be fleshed out, and you can find that on our website. At the end, you'll find all our tips in one slide, which is hopefully the one thing you take out of this presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
I had a bit of a turning point in my view on negotiations probably 15 years or so ago when I was on a trip to Peru with my wife, and we arrived at the airport after a long and harrowing flight, and the first step was to find a way to get into the center of the city. So I started negotiating with a cabbie about how much it was going to cost, and we were negotiating in the local currency, and I was feeling really good, and I'm like, you know what? I've got this guy figured out. He's going to be, I have some US cash with me that'll be really exciting. I'm going to switch it to US cash and see if I can get a better deal. So I did that. He took it immediately, and we got in the cab. And my wife leaned over to me and she said, you know, you gave him exactly the same amount in US as you were offering in the local currency. So I realized I got to sharpen my pencil a little bit. In terms of negotiations, that was 15 years ago, so hopefully the pencil's a little sharper now. One of the first things that I did about that was to dive into a more theoretical approach on negotiation. And if any of you have even started to Google negotiation theory, no doubt you've come across a book called Getting to Yes. We're not going to go through all of the detail that's contained in that book. It really is an absolutely fantastic reference source for information about negotiating theory. So I'm going to try and touch on kind of the 2-minute summary of Getting to Yes, but I would strongly encourage that if you haven't done so, that you pick it up and have a quick read through it, because it does give you an excellent foundation. As was alluded actually to in the introductory video, one of the main messages, if not the main message of Getting to Yes, is understanding the distinction between positional bargaining and interest-based bargaining. Positional bargaining is when you just say, yes, I want something, and you have no reason for it. Interest-based negotiations is more when you get past that first position and understand what's really motivating the person to say yes or to say no to the various things you want. So it's getting into that framework as part of a negotiation and not necessarily just saying, I'm gonna knock this out of the park and I'm not gonna give an inch and I don't care what they want, I know what I want. It's really about understanding not only what they want, but also what you want and why, and that provides a good foundation for a proper negotiation. From that basic principle, the Getting to Yes book kind of has a couple of major ideas. How many of you have ever heard the term BATNA? Okay, a few of you have. That's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So again, that's kind of a label to put to you thinking about what you would do if the person you're negotiating with ultimately says absolutely no to you. What's your backup plan? And that's always important to have in mind as one of the options, not the only option, but one of the options you need to be fully aware of because it'll define when you walk and when you cave. There'll be a lot of talk today about developing win-win options and kind of win options, but that again flows from that knowing what you want and why and what they know and what they want and why. And certainly one of the tools that's recommended in Getting to Yes is the use of objective criteria. So if you're bogged down on a point and you know why you want it, but you want to sell the point to someone else, to convince them why to take it, you might not want to tell them exactly why it's important to you, but you may want to refer to some sort of objective outside criteria to support what it is you're asking for. So that's the 2-minute version of Getting to Yes, and it's very theoretical, lots of great examples. I would encourage you to read it, but I'd like to turn it back over to Ted to talk about some of the strategic points, and then I'll be back to talk about tactics.
So strategy, like I said, it's really just taking a step back. Before you jump into the negotiation, it's figuring out what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it, thinking many steps ahead. And we're going to use a bunch of cliches, we're going to use a bunch of sayings and mixed metaphors, and you're going to tell us to stop doing that by the end of this. But one of the sayings that we use is play chess and not checkers. So think many steps ahead. Don't just think about your next move. Think about what you want to achieve at the end of the negotiation and think of the path to get to that end result. And in that sort of way of thinking, there's the idea of taking that step back and coming up with a game plan. So there's a difference. There's the idea of game calling, like calling your plays during the game, but this is all, my section is going to be all about game planning. And I think what does help in strategy, and I just think of strategy as planning to get what you want. I didn't do the strategy, the theory part on purpose. I'm sort of more about the end result. And I think one of the things that we want to really focus on is giving you some tools that you can take away from this so that when you get into your next negotiation, you're like, oh yeah, that's one of the 3 or 4 things I remember from that session. So that's going to be a real sort of focus of my section. So this one's all about setting, what's your goal? Like, do you want to just score a touchdown and win the game, or do you want to leave no time on the clock for the Patriots to score a touchdown? It's really, what do you want to achieve? And you do need to have some background work done, do your homework. And you want to think about where you want to go with this. Do you want to lose small or do you want to win big? So taking a step back, thinking about what your goals are in the negotiation is really key. One thing that I think is going to come out a lot is, do you want to win the battle or win the war? And we're going to litter this presentation with a bunch of practical examples. And one of them is litigation. Like, we have clients all the time who get involved in litigation, and your instinct when you're in litigation is to win. The problem with that is keeping litigation going and trying to win might end up hurting you if you're trying to sell your company down the road. So sometimes it makes sense to keep the eye on the prize and maybe settle the piece of litigation so that your company's cleaner and you can sell it. So a lot of the stuff that we do at the strategic section of this is really focusing on, what do you want to achieve? At the end of the day, what do you want to achieve? And there are other examples. I had a client the other day say to me, I gave my new employee, this hotshot employee, our standard employment agreement. No one's ever questioned some of these terms. And this new employee was really nitpicking all the standard terms, this and that. And it just really put my client, the employer, in a very awkward position, and now is going into the relationship thinking, is this the kind of person that I want to work with, invest in? So again, you really want to think about what you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to win the negotiation around that employment contract, or are you trying to set up yourself to be in a really good situation with a good company and sort of leading with the right moves right off the bat? Another example we had very, very recently is with a funding source, and the manager of the account was really focused on winning every single point. And every time we could lose, he made us lose. And it just really left a bad taste in our client's mouth. And so what happened was, as soon as our client was in a position to pay out that funding source, he did. And the relationship was ended. And now this funding source is out, a long-term relationship with a client that would have been otherwise very active. So again, some people don't like the tone of tough negotiations. So it really turns some people off. Some people treat it as a game, and so now we'll give you some tips on how to play the game. So again, like I said, think many moves ahead, treat it as chess and not checkers. And some of the rules that you can use both in setting out your game plan and in calling your plays, as Andrew will get into. Some of the rules of the game are very straightforward. Obviously, never lead with your best offer. No one expects you to accept that first offer. You should expect and plan for multiple offers, multiple iterations of a deal or an agreement. So you have to plan for that. Another key one is don't negotiate against yourself, right? You try to make the other party put the first offer on the table. Don't be the one to lead if you don't have to be. And some people take this whole process of negotiation personally. Like, when you say no or I can't do that, our message to you is in putting together your game plan, that's going to be part of this. You're going to be told on multiple occasions, no, I can't do this, or no, you can't have that. And it's just part of it. Don't take it too personally. That being said, some people do have trouble with playing the game. And what I find useful in giving advice to people who have trouble, attacking it like it's a game and trying to win. Some of the advice we give is, pick the person in your life who is the biggest SOB. The person who's most difficult in dealing with you, and pretend to be that person when you're doing this negotiation. So play, Jekyll and Hyde. Build yourself up to get into the negotiation, and there's a little bit of role playing that can help you sort of play the game that needs to be played. So doing your homework. So I think this is where a degree in psychology would help, or maybe just some common sense. So you want to try to read the other party. You want to try to listen. If you listen, it's incredible how much information you get about what is actually going on and where you can get to resolution. And some people don't. Some people just talk. And when you talk, you can't listen. So, try to read the other side, figure out what's motivating them, figure out, how they're compensated. Incentives drive behavior. So figure out how they're compensated, what's in it for them, what they've done in the past, what it is that they've done to achieve their goals, and maybe that's going to be informative as to what to do in the situation at hand. But doing your homework comes up in all sorts of examples when you're a startup company. And one of the key things that you'll have to decide to do is likely bring on strategic partners. So whether it's consultants, actual partners, fellow shareholders, bring in financing sources, so raising capital and bringing on financing sources. And one of the real things in that sort of exercise is figuring out how to value your company. What's your company worth? And how much to give this new financing source? How much to give this strategic partner? How much to give this hotshot recruit? And if you do your homework, you'll find comparables. You'll find out what companies like you are going for. It'll help when you're setting the price. It'll help you figure out what to start with. What's your negotiating position? Because if it's just a number you're picking out of thin air, it's not going to lead to a very productive conversation, because then it's just horse trading. It's not principled. You can always fall back on the basis in which that you're saying your company's valued at. So it's very useful to do your homework at the early stages so that you can have the conversations and you're not forced to retreat right out of the get-go. And one thing that we always talk about when we're negotiating service agreements or sale agreements is what's market. And again, doing your homework is very important to figuring out what's market. You can look at, there's all sorts of studies, no matter what industry you're in, if it's sales or legal. There's studies that can tell you what is appropriate, what's reasonable, and it's always useful to point to those objective standards instead of just literally making things up. So preparing your team, and this is where psychology also comes in. You see it all the time, whether it's in Law and Order. There's good cop, bad cop. There's the decision maker. There's the front line. There's usually a team that's negotiating some of these bigger agreements, especially agreements which involves raising capital, which is a big thing for startup companies, or eventually on the sale. So it's very important to make sure everyone on your team is flying in the same formation or rowing in the same direction. And you can only do that if you take that initial pause and figure out what everyone's roles are. Who has the authority to bind the company? Who has the authority to speak to the other side? If you don't do that, and if you're not coordinated as a team, you really lead yourself to be divided and conquered. And that's a tactic we see all the time, other side trying to accomplish. And that's, if you're an investment banker or a lawyer or a client selling a business, you get it all the time where the person buying the company will say, what's your lawyer up to? Why is your lawyer doing this? Can you call off your lawyer? And it's just a tactic, right? It's trying to drive that wedge between you and your team. And that's why if you're aware and you've been through the negotiations or you surround yourself with experienced counsel like people from Davis LLP, I'm just kidding. If you surround yourself with people who have gone through this before, you'll be ready to tackle and fight back against these tactics. One thing I had mentioned is that incentives drive behavior, and sometimes we see in deals that we're working on, you have to be careful who gets that final authority. If it's the sales guy, his incentive is to just sign the deal, and he'll get paid and move on. But you have to be careful if you're letting sales guys, with all due respect to sales guys, sign deals that include terms that would inhibit the principal from selling the business one day. So we see it all the time with service agreements. There's these things called assignment clauses or changes of control. And sales guys look right past it, like it's like another language to them. That's because it doesn't affect their day-to-day. It doesn't affect their compensation structure. But it does affect the owner of the business somewhere down the line. And again, that's part of this idea of doing your homework and taking a step back. It's not critical to you selling your service or getting paid in the moment, but if you don't think about it and put a large circle around the assignment clause or the change of control, it could come back and bite you somewhere down the line. So again, you want to make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction. And this is my favorite, it might be my favorite saying, and that's just developing a plan B, right? You need a plan B. I say it all the time to my clients. You need to figure out, in order to achieve what you're trying to achieve, in order to win or get what you want, you have to be willing to walk away. You have to be willing to have a backup plan. And we see it all the time with clients who are looking to raise capital. At the 11th hour, onerous terms are put to them, and if they don't have a plan B, they're left with no choice. And that is something you never want to say to me or someone else who does this for a living. I have no choice. You want to make sure you have a choice. You always want to keep a couple irons in the fire. You want to make sure that you're looking at different alternatives, because putting all your eggs, see all these mixed metaphors, putting all your eggs in one basket is not going to help you, because at the 11th hour, terms will be put to you that you're going to want to walk away. And if you have that plan B, you're going to be able to walk away. So it is critical to, throughout the process, develop your options, create a plan B so that you can have options to go to if the first thing doesn't work out for you.
it's good to have thought about various tactics and not just your strategy, because negotiations can end up being a bit of improvisation once you're into it. And you have to know and be able to pivot and take different tacks as you're moving through the process. One thing that can really help to keep people moving through the process is something you call deal tension. And deal tension is just that sense of panic and urgency on one side or on both sides to get a deal done. And it can come from all sorts of places, external factors that make people want to get through the deal a lot faster and can force them to make decisions they might not otherwise make. So where there's an opportunity to manipulate deal tension in your favor, so if you're patient and you know the other side isn't, and you can kind of crank up the tension on them, that can be a very, very effective tactic to move through a negotiation. So it can be important to think about that really early on in the negotiation, because what you might need to do is set some rules of the game. A pretty common example of a way to escalate the deal tension across the course of the deal is to use something like an auction process. For example, we were trying to help one of our clients sell their business a few years ago, and ended up working with iBankers, as we often do, to develop, it was something like 45 people who were interested, 45 companies who were at some level interested in buying into this company. And when you tell person A that there's 44 others lined up for the same deal, it can really get them motivated to make concessions and even start with an offer that they might not otherwise start. So that's an easy way to manipulate deal tension. You can also do it in the moment. And one of the partners that I've worked with a whole bunch of times was able to create all sorts of tension by just remaining awkwardly silent in the middle of a conversation. So she'd be like, what's going on? Is the phone disconnected? And you could just see people sweat. But it can, again, make them say the next thing when you don't want to be the one to say the next thing. So that can be a very effective sort of tactic. I talk again, and I often go back to examples that are related to selling your business. So if you're interested in selling your business and you found a potential partner that you're very excited about working with, one of the first things you might do is enter into a letter of intent with that person for the sale of your business. It will set out in a non-binding way kind of the general idea you have for the deal. And then if you've talked to your lawyer, you'll probably also put some binding terms in that agreement. And one of the things you may end up negotiating about, and this is about setting the rules of the game, is the first negotiation. One of the provisions you may include is an exclusivity clause or a no-shop clause. So I'll work with you for 60 days to explore this deal, and you can't talk to anybody else about it. You can't go find your stalking horse. You can't find other people to do this with, to lock it up. So that can be helpful because it keeps people focused. But as the deal progresses, we had one where there was an exclusivity clause, and we were the seller, and it expired, and the other side was like, well, let's just tack on another 30 days and keep talking. And it was the perfect opportunity to give them the impression that, you know what, we've just been waiting for this time to run out because we've got other people who are interested in your business. So thinking about that, thinking about ways to get people kind of wound up can be a very effective tactic. And a lot of that has to do with time. Time is an extremely powerful tool in negotiations, and one that you can never lose sight of from the moment you start planning the negotiation to the final hour when you're sweating it out at midnight trying to get something done. And time can be relevant in a whole bunch of different ways. I mentioned the possibility of, maybe there's a contractual provision like an exclusivity clause that is essentially a ticking clock. You may know that, for example, if you're offering to provide goods or services that your customer, your client is going to incorporate into something they're trying to do, perhaps they have a deadline. And I see that quite frequently. As mentioned at the beginning, I've done quite a bit of work in the power sector, including project development, renewable solar and wind power project development. And time becomes a deadline because in those contracts, the contracts for the sale of the power, there's a deadline to get the project built. So if you're the person assisting the owner in building that project, you know that deadline and you can stall your negotiations until suddenly you're stuck right in the middle of the critical path and they have to sign something with you and get more motivated to do so. Cash flow limitations can be a problem. If you know someone's running out of money or their credit is about to expire, that can be very helpful in creating a time pressure. Ted mentioned the motivations of different people who participate in a deal. If you've got that salesman on the other side, he may be trying to pad his numbers for the next quarter because that's what he's going to get comped on in terms of commission. So he may have a pressure that's personal to him and outside of the deal that can be used to your advantage. But sometimes you'll find yourself on the wrong side of the time pressure, and there are ways to turn that around and defend against it. I mean, first of all is to recognize when it's happening and to have planned ahead so you don't get jammed up. But sometimes you may have to ask for something to relieve your time pressure. And we see sometimes where you have, when we're acting for a small entity, maybe an emerging company new to the market, and sitting on the other side of the table is someone much bigger and more established. One way of flipping the clock around is to say, I'm new to this game. I need some time to consider I got to read this carefully. I got to talk to my lawyer. I got to do whatever that lets me step away from the table for a little while and play up what you are as a reason for doing that. Ted mentioned that sometimes you just got to be the tough guy. And being the aggressor is absolutely a tactic you can bring to negotiations. And it's one that personally I'm not by nature comfortable with. I mean, I have an engineering background, so I look at something and I think, there's an obvious solution to this problem, and everybody probably sees that, and let's just agree to it and move on and be nice about it. But sometimes you do have to be the SOB, and you got to be tough. And that's fine, because negotiation is a game. It's not about hurt feelings when you're talking about business negotiations, at least. So it can be totally appropriate to take that very aggressive approach or moderately aggressive approach. And it's also important to realize that when someone's coming at you like that, it could just be an act. I was working on a negotiation recently where we had clients in the room, lawyers in the room, and we were essentially presenting our draft to the other side. And their lawyer just went off. He was ballistic, asking if we'd advised our client. We even talked to them about any of this. He was flipping his pen. His junior associate was sighing in the corner every 5 minutes. And they were just trying to be the big, nasty bear. And it was childish. And it actually worked out really, really well for us because their client saw the light and folded on almost every point in that negotiation session. And it was awesome to see the lawyer get even more frustrated. So all of that to say, being the aggressor is fine, but it's also important not necessarily always to be the aggressor, because if you develop a reputation for someone with only bark and no bite, who doesn't have anything behind the positions they're taking, that reputation will precede you, because you are going to develop a reputation in the marketplace. So it's very important to use aggression as a tactic, not as a way of life. Another fun tactic to use, and one that Ted is, I would say, a master of, is chipping away. And by chipping away, I mean that you can always ask for one more thing. No matter how close you think you are to the end of the deal, no matter how agreeable everybody is and willing to shake hands and let's go have a beer and celebrate this, there's always time to ask for one more thing. And it's certainly worth doing, because you may never get a chance to make that request again. So you don't want to leave stuff on the table. And often the worst outcome that you're going to get is a no from the other side, or a maybe, and then you get something different. Chipping away also helps by putting all sorts of issues on the table. So if you're if you identify a bunch of different issues all at once, because you're just chipping away, then suddenly you've got all this currency to work with in terms of horse trading. You may have identified 10 issues that are super important to you and 10 that aren't, and the other side may not know which is which, and you're able to trade things and make concessions with all those things you've chipped away at. So that can be very helpful to keep the negotiations going. And Ted's example of, Ted mentioned assignability clauses, and I had this happen literally 2 weeks ago, where we'd gone through a great negotiation and doing the last read through of the agreement, and I noticed they had the exact wrong assignability clause in there of what we wanted. And I had to go back, and this is a great way to use your lawyers. I had to go back and fall on my sword and say, you know what, we missed this, sorry. Can we talk about it now? And the other side was willing to talk about it, so we made progress on that point. So it's absolutely okay to keep chipping away at things. The defense against someone who's chipping away at you is to try and bundle up issues. And there is a right time and a wrong time to do this. I'd say in almost every deal, you end up reaching a point in the discussions where there's going to be a strong desire to bundle up the last few things, the important things, and settle them as a package. So not agree to one thing or another, because someone who's chipping away at you will get you to agree to 5 things and then ready to raise 5 more, and you don't want to do that. So eventually you bundle up your hay and you decide what you're going to do with it. And I mentioned this is a really common outcome in negotiations, and for those of you who've worked through complex negotiations, you'll know what I'm talking about, where you can start with just an issues list or a couple of, a long list of things that people have identified as problems with the deal, and you kind of hammer that away, toss some of them to your lawyer to negotiate, and you end up at the end of the funnel with just those 3 or 4 things that need to be decided. And that's part of the iterative process that Ted described. The planning to do multiple offers and multiple cycles through things is very important, because it kind of shakes out the wheat from the chaff, so you end up with the really important things towards the end. And you will see that absolutely in any big deal. And one thing that bundling issues together can sometimes let you do is let someone, the real decision maker, kind of emerge from behind the curtain and make the final deal. So whereas your deal team may have been at the table, the lawyers, the business folks, just hammering away at this thing for weeks, CEOs lurking in the background, and when you got that short list of items bundled up and ready to go, that's when they come in and do the important deal. That's what you can refer to as appealing to higher authorities. And it's a tactic that you can use and can certainly watch out for. There's a saying that, if you're not in the room, you're not in the deal. That's definitely not always true if someone's holding back their real decision maker. So it's important to understand that you may not be dealing with the people who can make the decisions. And you can kind of test that early on in the negotiation by putting some tough points to people and seeing, are they the types who will say yes and commit to something across the table, or are they like the small fry I described before, who pleads kind of, I'm not sophisticated enough to deal with this, can we pick it up tomorrow? That probably means they're going to talk to someone who's not at the table, who you need to understand is involved in the negotiation. So it can be using that appeal to higher authorities. If it's you who's doing it, it can be super helpful to defend against some of the other tactics that I've talked about. I mean, if you're being put under time pressure, you say, I got to go talk to so-and-so about this, I need more time. Or if you got that bear chomping at your face, you can take time to calm down and go talk to the other person. Or as I mentioned, if someone's chipping away, you can bundle up and then go to that higher authority to resolve the final issues. And this is also a tactic that can be employed on the fly during a negotiation. So maybe you have had the CEO sitting at the table through most of the negotiations, and then you're coming down to a really contentious part. And for whatever reason, to gain leverage, to preserve a separate relationship between the CEO and his or her equivalent on the other side of the deal, you say, they really wanted to be here today, but they got pulled into this other thing, and weren't able to attend, and that can kind of lower the temperature and allow you to deal with those issues on the side, and then ultimately still have that person to come in and rock the final decision. So it's certainly a tactic to use and to watch out for. One of the ones that Ted mentioned is divide and conquer, and I feel kind of like a jerk advocating all these tough tactics, but they are useful, and I'm telling you about them as much so you can defend against them when they happen. We do quite a bit of work with companies that are kind of in the engineering services type of space. And in my experience, when you're dealing with those deals, you often have quite a few stakeholders involved in the negotiation. Certainly, you'll have the CEO sitting in the background. You'll have that commissioned salesperson chomping at the bit to get a deal done because their commission depends on it. And they can be great. I mean, I have all the respect in the world for salespeople because they can take a beating during a negotiation in terms of being told it's their fault, they're doing stuff wrong, why are they causing this problem, I thought we had a deal. And a good salesperson will absorb all of that like a sponge and come right back to the table and keep it going. But the truth is they probably want to close quickly. You may also have engineers at the table, if you're talking about technical sales, or whoever's ultimately going to be responsible for delivering whatever it is you've sold. And they too are going to have a totally different perspective on what's going on. They're probably going to be of the mind of, oh my goodness, I hope that commission sales guy doesn't overpromise and then leave me scrambling to figure out how we're going to fulfill the promises that he's made. And then, the CEO in the background. So if you're involved in a negotiation, you see all those sorts of personalities out, and Ted gave a different example with the lawyer and the iBanker. It can be you can use that certainly to your tactical advantage, especially if you've got relationships in each of those different silos on the other side that may have different levels of decision making, but you can kind of get back channel information, you can deliver messages that help drive that wedge, or on the flip side of dividing and conquering, you can use those relationships to understand what's going on in the background and what's really motivating the people at the table so you can get to a deal. And you got to guard so carefully against it because it is a tactic that can really derail a negotiation, particularly if you think you've got the thing corralled, if you're leading the negotiation. To find out that someone made some promise or provided some information outside of the context of the negotiation can totally change your leverage and your ability to get what you want. So it goes back to Ted's point about flying in tight formation. Even if you do that, all of that, you're probably going to run into deadlocks in negotiations, and it might be right near the end, things you can't settle, things that are just going to jam up the deal entirely. And Ted's example of using deal studies and external information is a really, really common way to try and deal with some of those tough things, some of those tough deadlocks. And sometimes it's an easy thing to do because you appeal to an external standard and people come around. Sometimes you got to be just arbitrary and flip a coin or split the baby and deal with it that way. And then there are even sophisticated products for dealing with it. We've deal frequently with insurers, and one thing that they've started pushing in the last few years is really representation and warranty insurance. So if you can't come to an agreement about reps and warranties, you might be able to buy protection against that and just park the issue and say, hey, we'll pay this insurer some premiums, and if things go wrong, we'll collect from them rather than fighting about it between us. And then sometimes you gotta press that big red button during a negotiation. And that's something you got to do really, really carefully. Like, I wish I'd been able to find an image that had kind of the plexiglass case over the top of the button, and you had to peel back, because you want to be very careful about using the big red button. And it can take a lot of forms. It can be the walkout, I'm done, I'm out of here. It can be filing that lawsuit that you've been drafting in the background for weeks on end in parallel to conducting the negotiations. If you're trying to settle a payment dispute with someone, you could sit at the table and talk till you guys are both ready to pass out, but on the side you may be planning just to sue them for it. Other ways of pressing the button, say, you know what, I got other offers, I don't really need to continue this. I can walk out of the room right now. But you want to be, as I say, really careful about when you use that, because it can be the end of the negotiation if you use it too soon. And certainly if you develop a reputation of a walkout artist or someone who's always pressing the panic button, you're not going to be taken seriously. But it also might not be in your best interest. We've recently been working on an issue where it was about money that was owed to our client. And they went through a long and torturous process, and they were being jerked around, and every tactic that we've talked about was being used against them, and they were super frustrated by it. And they had instructed us to be ready with the litigation and ready to deploy it. But the circumstances around the case changed a little bit. There were kind of a few rays of light that we started to see. So we said, maybe I know you're anxious to really stick it to these guys, but let's hold off for a few more weeks. And there was a breakthrough in the negotiations. It doesn't mean we're done, and it doesn't mean that we won't have to hammer that button eventually. But it was a good thing we didn't do it then, because if you do it too soon, you've blown up the negotiation and destroyed any goodwill you may have developed with the other side, and that's nothing that you really want to do. So that's it for the tactics, and we are available for any questions that you guys may have.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So you're a startup and you're multitasking a gazillion things. Suddenly you find you need a lawyer. How do you shop for a lawyer?
Oh, geez.
I think one of the 1,000 things you have to do when you're an entrepreneur is always to be expanding your network. And the first thing you may be thinking about when talking about your network is your customers or your suppliers or even sources of money. But it makes a whole bunch of sense for your network also to include things like lawyers and accountants and eventually investment bankers, all of those types of professionals who might help, and also talking to other people who have been in your shoes and know people. And really, honestly, the best way to pick people like us from amongst the crowd is to have a personal recommendation, someone who's had a good experience with them. And the only way you're going to find someone who can make that recommendation is if you're out there meeting as many people as you possibly can.
So the different verticals, so I'm not in building, but you would look for somebody in your own space then?
Yes.
You mean industries?
Industries, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think that helps, especially with industries that are very different than other industries. There are similar industries, but then there's some that are, like the power industry is very regulated and therefore very different. So having a lawyer who has the expertise in that area would be helpful. But I actually think startups and emerging companies, it's its own vertical and it's a different industry. And I think when you're shopping for a lawyer, you need to be able to, just like you would call a power lawyer, you want to call someone who's familiar with dealing with startups, and whether it's the 1,000 things they have to deal with, just understanding what it's like to be in their shoes, knowing how painful it is to write a check to pay for lawyers, just being able to understand and relate, I think, is important too.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just checking to see if there's anybody else at one of the other mics. You use the mea culpa, but you didn't actually say that that would be a tactic that you could use. In a startup or in any other situation, it's possible that you may be the one who's wrong, that you're making the mistake. And I do think that there's a time and a place and a necessity to, as you say, fall on your sword, to say, I'm sorry, it was my mistake. And if you're not willing to do that, I think that can bode very badly for you as well. Can you speak to that?
No, I would agree 100%. And it is about picking the proper time to do that. Depends on what type of negotiation you're involved in. If you're buying a car, it's not a long-term relationship, you probably don't care. But if it's the type of relationship where trust is going to be ongoing and you're going to continue working with that person, an absolute great way to develop someone's trust is to admit when you're wrong.
I just want to go back to one of the examples that you mentioned about if somebody from your team is over-promising and you're the technical person sitting next to them, do you actually interrupt the negotiation and tell the other party that actually, no, we can't do that, or you just let it go and wait until the end? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the slide, Andrew did a great job on putting the slides together. I thought the best one was the clock, and using time. And time doesn't sound like I'm going to answer your question, but I am eventually going to answer your question. Okay. I think in those circumstances, I wouldn't actually put them in the same room. I would keep them separate and allow the business guy or the sales guy to do a portion of it, and then not let the technical guy be put in an awkward position. Because if you're in that situation and we're together negotiating, you're the engineer and I'm the lawyer, it's very awkward. Like if I'm out there trying to sell something and promising on his behalf, like what's he going to do? So I think it speaks to the fact that you got to use time and be strategic about when to bring everyone together, how to keep people apart. But also, it's back to my point about doing your homework. Don't put yourself in that position where I'm promising things on your behalf and you can't think about whether you can deliver. Yeah. So I think that's part of the strategy point that we were trying to make.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Ted and Andrew, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You presented a very clear, it was a very clear presentation on what can sometimes be an unclear topic, and you did such a good job that we don't even have any more questions. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week for contract manufacturing. Good night.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.